So hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fireside Management Chat. Good to see you here in person as well. If you're first time here, the Fireside Management Chat is a series of seminars organized by Johns Hopkins Graduate Consulting Club. And I'm Jia Chen, Director of Education. So I will be organizing the seminars this year. So in Fireside Management Chat, we plan to invite speakers with consulting working experiences or someone who have a deep understanding of biotech or healthcare related industries to share their insights about consulting or their work. So if you know such people and really want to meet them and hear your sharing, you can email me. I will put my email in the chat later. So I will try my best to invite him, her, or them to give a talk. And today I'm very glad to have Michelle Levine here by my side in person. I believe this is the first time we held an in-person event in 2 years, I think, for the Graduate Consulting Club. And so Michelle is a former Biochemistry, Cellular and Molecular Biology graduate student here at Hopkins. She used to be a part of the consulting club as well, I believe. And after graduation, she joined ClearView as a strategy consultant for biopharm clients. And after a year and a half, she left consulting and joined Solasta Ventures, a leading South Korean venture capital firm in the Boston office. She soon became a senior associate and served as a life science investor. And today she will be sharing with us the Venture Capital 101 and how she successfully transitioned from PhD to consulting and to venture capital. So without further ado, let's welcome Michelle.
Thanks, Jen. All right, hello everyone, and thanks for sort of bearing with us in this hybrid format. It should be fun. I hope that it will be beneficial to sort of everyone here, whether it be in person or through Zoom. I will say this is probably, the first thing I've done like this, since COVID started. So I'm excited to be here in person in Baltimore, but definitely understand those who are remote as well. So it's nice to meet you all. I'm hoping this can be sort of like ask me anything kind of situation where it's more of a discussion rather than me flipping through slides and sort of talking at you all for the next hour. But yeah, so please interrupt me if you'd like. I'd love to also understand a little bit about what everyone's background is. I know when I was in the middle of graduate school here, I didn't know anything about venture capital until Third Rock Venture Funds, which is one of the kind of top company creation funds in Boston, came on campus at Hopkins and gave a talk. And that was my first introduction to VC. So I imagine some of you might be sort of in the same position. So I'd love to that's why I put a little VC 101 type of slide in here, but definitely don't want to sort of assume that anyone knows anything. So there are no dumb questions, basically is what I'm trying to get to. So please feel free to interrupt. We're all in the same boat at one point where we knew nothing about VC, nothing about consulting. So yes, definitely want to make it accessible to everyone and want it to be useful to you as well. I don't want to waste anyone's time. So just intro slide, as Jia Chen mentioned, I got my PhD from Hopkins in BCMB. I was in Andrew Holland's lab in the molecular biology and genetics department. Then went to ClearView Healthcare Partners for consulting. Happy to talk about sort of generalist versus life science specific consulting options. And then made the leap a little over a year ago to venture capital, which is sort of my long-term goal. And now I need to figure out what the next long-term goal is, but I'm very fortunate to be in venture capital. I'm really enjoying it. And I'm happy to talk about VC, albeit everyone keep in mind, I've been in it for about a year. So I'm not I'm not 20 years down the line expert, but I'm happy to give sort of entry level insights, if you will. But I've really been enjoying it. So, as I've sort of alluded to and sort of what Jia Chen mentioned is, I'm happy to talk today about sort of career choices that you all might be thinking about and sort of, what my thought process was for going from, PhD to consulting to VC. Happy to give sort of high level intro to venture capital. And then lastly, sort of what are the potential paths to getting to VC or what can you do after consulting? Because I do have a lot of friends who went to consulting and then went afterwards to other options or are currently exploring options and applying broadly from a consulting position. So happy to give both my own insights as well as secondhand insights from the friends that I have. So that's sort of the lay of land for today, but definitely anyone can interrupt at any time. So I'll try to put pauses in to remind myself to let you guys kind of speak up, but feel free to unmute yourselves, ask questions, type it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. I guess I should also make sure that everyone can hear me, right? Okay, great. Okay, cool. So yes, I'm seeing nods, so that's great. And people in person can also hear me, which is great. Great. So maybe just to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm happy to sort of, actually, maybe before I jump into this, I should actually follow the outline that I tried to craft on this slide, which is, or else I would not be a very good consultant if I didn't actually follow this. So why consulting? So I'm sure as many of you who might be exploring consulting have heard, if you go from a PhD into consulting, first of all, many different consulting funds within both Boston and elsewhere, within generalist as well as life sciences are looking for PhDs. I think they really like, not so much like the content knowledge, but maybe some of that for life science specific consulting, but more so like the other skills that you learn, like how to think critically, how to problem solve. I think you all are probably aware of this, but I think, that you're desperately sought after, I guess, for these, consulting positions, which is great. And then from there, if you've kind of decided you don't want to necessarily stay at the bench your whole life, like consulting is only going to open doors from there. So from the consulting position, let's say you're trying to just get a good working business knowledge, learning how to think like strategically more, away from bench, but more strategically about high level business, different problems that, biotech or pharma companies might need to solve, different problems that just businesses in general need to solve for. It's a great kind of mini MBA, if you will, or a great little business experience that you get paid as you're learning, which is also wonderful coming out of the PhD. So I think it definitely doesn't, like I said, close any doors if you're thinking you want to go to business development, if you want to go towards venture capital, if you want to go into, basically any position on the business side within a company. You can become an entrepreneur afterwards. The doors really are open. I know I've said that a few times, but I really want to emphasize that because that was, I think, the rationale for me and for a lot of my friends who went to consulting from the PhD is, it's only going to set you up well for having that sort of knowledge, being a better candidate for the next job. And, consulting itself is a really fun job because you're constantly learning, which I think is something that we really love within the PhD, right? Is learning new things, trying to problem solve. So it really satisfies that intellectual curiosity as well. So I think that was sort of my reason for consulting and the reason I hear most commonly from my friends who did consulting. I will say for me, there was the added benefit of the more I had informational interviews with venture capitalists, which is, what I thought I wanted to pursue long-term after Third Rock did come on campus and it sounded wonderful. And I'll explain more about why VC is so cool in a second. But for me, I kept hearing a common path to venture capital is through consulting. So that was sort of the impetus for my jump into consulting. And so that's a bit around why consulting. Any questions? And I'm curious, everyone's consideration here also with, why you all are thinking about consulting, or if I missed anything about what you think consulting might be like. And I think there's something in the chat here, so I'm going to read that.
Yes. Hi, Michelle.
Okay.
I'm Ria.
Hi.
And I'm currently a Master's of Public Health student at Johns Hopkins. And I have applied to a couple of consulting firms and I'm actually waiting for their results. And these are mostly biopharma, health, tech consulting firms. So I'm still waiting for their results, but my next immediate option would be to apply to VC firms, especially in health tech or biopharma. So, just wanted to ask you if you have any, later in your, sorry to interrupt you now, but later in your presentation, if you could also mention any names of VCs that one can look at, especially in the health space, because I'm an international student. I can only work in a field which is related to my major. So I can't really have a drastically different career path because of my visa restrictions. So especially, startups or VCs in the San Fran area, if you could give and throw any names and then I can look them up. And just wanted to ask you if you could also address in your slide deck on, what the interview prep for VC firms looks like. Are these case interviews? How number heavy are they? So yeah, I just had these couple of questions.
Sure. Okay. So let me just make sure I am tracking them all. So I think, maybe later on I can name drop some VCs. I don't have it in the slide deck, but happy to just sort of chat through it live if that's helpful. And then the kind of second part of your question was more about the interview process for VC firms, right? And then, what that looks like. Yeah, happy to do that. I'm just trying to think if, I can jump into sort of the interview process now, if that's helpful. But maybe before I get to that, maybe I should just like level set to make sure we all actually know what VC is, so that when I talk about the interview, it'll make sense of, why they're asking the things they're asking in their interviews. So if you don't mind, if you could just bear with me for a few minutes, and I promise I'll get to your questions. And if I miss anything, definitely pipe up. Again, I really appreciate the questions, and I want this to be helpful to everyone. So, okay, great. So I think I kind of laid out why consulting, why VC. I might kind of loop into what VC actually is, just to make sure it makes sense. So venture capital, in sort of bare bones, I think most people may be aware of it through like Shark Tank, like the television show. But essentially, what venture capitalists do is they, they have capital, so money. I'm just going to keep it very, very simple. So they, give money to startups that are in need of funds to help advance their, in the case of biotech, their programs, or it could be products, whatever it might be, to advance their products to a place where they can either earn revenue or have some sort of revenue generating potential, whether it be through pharma partnerships, for example, with biotech, or through to like an improved product. But because these companies are private, they're not being, traded on the stock market. The way that they get money is through private investments, and that's what venture capitalists do. So in exchange for the capital that we invest into these companies, we own a percentage of the company. So we get equity in the company. And the other part to it is we can also, alongside, providing capital, we can also often get a board seat. And so we can help, meet with the company quarterly to help guide the direction of the company. And so a lot of venture capitalists will have, because they've reviewed many different types of companies that they've invested in, and so they've gained a lot of experience either by being entrepreneurs themselves or being on the board of many different companies. They've gained insights on what works and what doesn't, and different business models that are successful within that industry. And so as a board member, you can help meaningfully contribute to sort of give advice and feedback to the management team of that company. So it's sort of, and sorry, I'm seeing that someone is in a waiting room. I should probably admit them, right? Okay, so that's essentially, in a nutshell, like what we do as venture capitalists is, we review a startup that's in need of funds, they're fundraising. We alongside other venture capital firms will give money, and they're typically raising a set amount of money, let's say $20 million for the Series A raise, which is oftentimes like the second fundraising round. And we'll say, okay, like after we review the company, and I'll get through the whole process of our analysis in a minute, but okay, we'll give you $5 million in exchange, we'll get in exchange, let's say 5% of the company, I'm making this up, and also a board seat, so we can keep track of how the company's doing. And maybe if we really like the trajectory of that company, we'll also invest in follow-on financing rounds. Okay, so that's sort of the process of how investment works. I will say, one of the other questions is, okay, that's great. We want to invest $5 million in the company, but where do we as VCs get our money from? Like, I'd love to say that I can just, pull it out of my pocket, but I, graduated from Hopkins, 2.5 years ago, and not there yet. So anyway, so we have limited partners, which I have up here on the top right of the slide. So these limited partners are, oftentimes institutions or organizations that have a large amount of money that they want to invest long-term. So it could be like endowment funds. You could think of like, Harvard is known to have a very large endowment. Like, so they, have a ton of money that you don't want to just have it sit there in a bank. It'd be great if it could grow over time, and then you can reinvest in the university, for example, and be able to provide, have that money go much further than the original, let's say, I don't even know what it is at Harvard, but billions of dollars or whatever of their endowment. So that's one example of a limited partner we can have. There's many other types: pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, high net worth individuals, that will all sort of come together, and we can have many different limited partners that come together into one fund. So as you may have seen, like after the success of Moderna, Flagship now raised, a multi-billion-dollar recent fund. And I don't know who their limited partners or LPs are, but I'm sure everyone has like lots of confidence in Flagship. So they had a multi-billion-dollar fund that now from that fund, they can, dish out as they create more companies. And sort of the whole point though is, I will say, for limited partners, we have to return their investment. So we have 8 years to like successfully, seed different companies and give money to different companies. And then by having a diversified portfolio of, let's say $100 million fund that we have, we give 5 to 10 million to different companies. We can, some companies are going to do super well, some might do so-so, some might do not so well. Hopefully they all succeed. But the point is, after 8 years, we have to return the money that we gained from those investments back to our limited partners. And the way that that typically happens is once we've invested in a company, we help see it through, and then we can exit our position within that company once it either goes public, so it IPOs, or it gets acquired by a big, in our case, big pharma player, because I'm at a biotech VC. And now that the market within biotech is so hot, mostly not only due to COVID, but for many reasons, the biotech market's hot. There's tons of capital and lots of companies that are innovating, which is very exciting. More and more now, these companies are actually going into the public market, IPOing, before they even have clinical data, which in the past was sort of unheard of, because you don't actually have, a lot of times their valuation is informed, like how much they're worth is informed by how great their data are. And if you're working on very limited preclinical data sets, you're sort of just valuing the company or thinking that it's like a $5 billion company off of just the promise of their technology platform, which I don't know, I can get carried away on this, but it is kind of a crazy market and very exciting to be part of. But we'll see kind of where it goes in the future. I'm interested to see if the markets kind of calm down a little bit and actually start to be more informed on data. So anyway, so I know I was just trying to keep it brief. I know I get a little carried away, but that is sort of VC in a nutshell. Are there any questions about this? I want to make sure that this is clear, so that way when I talk about kind of the day-to-day and as well as the interview process, it's very clear. So yes, I have a question in the room from Oliver. Yes.
So Michelle, I know that hedge funds require that you have like really high profits or like estimates for the growth of revenue.
Mm-hmm.
If I understand correctly, VCs invest in even more younger companies.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't they, or do they actually require even higher revenue streams or like expansions?
No, it's an interesting question. So the question, just to make sure everyone heard, was, how does this, so a lot of times you kind of want to be assured as an investor into a fund, like whether it's like, a hedge fund, or you're investing in a hedge fund or you're investing in a venture capital fund, do you have sort of a guarantee on the return on investment? Like, is there a minimum that you have to meet? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so does a VC require that the estimate of revenue growth is even higher for VCs than it's for hedge funds?
I don't know. We don't necessarily have like a requirement. I guess what we aim for and sort of what we hope for is about a 3x return on our investment. So if we invest $5 million in a company, we hope that it will return to us 15 million. And that's sort of our target. And I'm actually not super familiar with like what the hedge fund multiple is, but that's our hope. And again, the way that comes to fruition is we tend to invest very early, as you mentioned, and the revenue or the way that the company is able to return us money is because it goes into the public market or because it gets acquired. Let's say, we invested in a company, it was valued at $10 million, super early stage, $10 million. We invested 5 million into it. I don't know, that's kind of a crazy scenario, but let's say we did that. And then, it gets acquired 3 years later by Pfizer for, $1 billion or something crazy like that. Then we're able to like return way more than 3x. But if we have to hold on to that company for 5, 6, 7 years before it gets acquired or actually goes public, then, and it only gets acquired for, 2x of, what it was valued at when we invested in it, then it's not so great. Or like the worst case scenario is there's no acquisition, no IPO, which means that there's no liquidation event for our investment within the 8-year span of when we're supposed to return the money that LPs gave us back to them, then we're in a little bit of trouble. So I think there are some like hazards and there are some targets that we try to hit. Of course, it's not always within our control, but we try to do, like, our whole role is to try to control for that and try to make sure we're only making investments that we think can return 2 or 3x at least on our investment. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
It does. One thing I wonder about,
Mhm.
most of the startups don't work out, right?
Yeah, I forget what the latest percentage is,
I
but
think like 10%, I read once or sometimes, that they actually work out and they have an IPO. So
yeah.
you kind of expect from the rest, like if you calculate it's only 10%, you would need an expectation of a 30x return.
Yeah,
Because-
so
No.
yeah, no, the great point. So the point was basically like if a lot of startups fail, then like what happens? Like what do you do? What do you tell your investors? So I will say, I mean, in the past year that I've been doing this, the market has been so crazy. And also even just looking at, I should say, like at Solasta Ventures, we've invested in about 30 different biotech companies in the past 8 years that our Boston office has been open. And I mean, just the way, I don't think that that's actually happened, that scenario's happened. And the way that it's been working in the past 2 to 3 years with the super hot market, the reason why there's so much capital coming from private investors is because the amount of companies going public is astronomical these days. So I think it's more likely that companies fail after going public, but at least they go public, if that makes sense. And that seems to be the dynamics right now, when that might not have been the case 5-10 years ago. So we're in a slightly different scenario now. Not saying there are no failures, definitely don't want to come across like, oh yes, all success, everything's great. Unfortunately, there are failures, and I guess that is necessary because hopefully you learn from them and that kind of thing. And everyone knows things in science, you could plan for the best things to happen and things fail. But at least recently, it's been so that private investors can still exit their investment. So it might be something where on the public side, like public equity investors, so there are a set of investors that when a company goes public, they invest a lot, and that a lot of hedge funds do that, right? That might be more of a problem for later stage investors, because again, we're the companies that we're investing in are going public before they even have clinical data, and it could very well that their main program fails in the clinic, but at that point we're probably not investors in them, or we have like a very small percentage that we've still held on to. Because I should also say, sorry if I'm getting like too in the weeds here, I'm trying to also keep an eye on the time, but the way that we sort of exit our position is that when a company goes public, there's a 6-month lockup period where we can't sell, if we own 5 million of a company or $10 million of a company, so it's let's say it's a few percentages of equity in that company, even a couple percentage points, if you sell all of those shares and you need now others to buy into that company, that could really make the stock tank when it's public. So they try to avoid that happening by having that 6-month lockup period post the company going public. And also once that lockup expires and we can start selling our equity or our shares in that company, it would be really bad on all accounts if we sold all of our shares at once. First of all, there's not going to be enough people to buy them all up right away, and that will also make the stock tank. And so you have to be somewhat thoughtful about it. And the other point too is like, what if they have great looking data like 6 months later in the clinic? Then the hope would be, we could, the stock price that we would sell at is even higher, and therefore we would have even higher returns. So we could lose out on that. So once we liquidate our position, when it goes public, let's say, we have to be very strategic about it. So we could still lose out, I guess, a portion if, it fails when we don't sell it at the right time, right? And then the company ends up failing. But that's less typical than if we were a public only public equity investor. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I'm also managing admitting people, so glad to see more people join. So hopefully those who are joining kind of throughout this are not too lost. We're just talking about venture capital, VC 101. Hopefully you can also see on the slide, I tried to make it like very straightforward, but again, if there are any questions, definitely let me know. And as I said at the top of the hour, like there are no dumb questions here. Everyone knew nothing about consulting, nothing about VC at one point. So please feel free to speak up. And I do see, oh, okay, awesome. I just want to make sure I took care of the chat too. So we're all good. Okay, so any other questions? Great questions, by the way, Oliver. So any other questions before I move on to like our process of even choosing which companies we want to invest in? And I think it's a fairly similar process across all venture capital funds. So hopefully it'll be informative. All right, so if there are no questions, I will move on. And then Ria, I will not forget your question about how to even apply, but maybe I can just get through making investment, because actually the interview process mimics a lot of what you have to do with the thinking through an investment process. So I'll get through this and then I'll get back to you. Okay. And then I also have a question about suggestions on doing part-time consulting management. Okay, so maybe I can address that at the end, if that's okay. I can just get through this process here and then and talk about the different fund types and then get to those questions, if that's okay. Okay, so I'll try to also keep this brief because I definitely want time for lots of questions. So how do we even think about what companies we want to invest in? So I don't expect you to read the tiny little font here. I'm hoping that I can just kind of walk through it and we can discuss it. But in terms of making an investment, the first thing is, how do we even hear about the companies that are fundraising, right? Because not all companies will need money every minute of every day. Like, they won't be fundraising. That takes up a lot of time. They have to be thoughtful about when they actually want to raise the money. Like, hopefully they'll have recently had some milestones or some, interesting outcomes on their data that they can then present to investors and say, look, we've made X progress since with X amount of money in the past. Like, you should trust us that we're going to also make great progress if you give us money now. So that's like the basics of, them thinking through when to fundraise. And a lot of times they'll fundraise because they need money to, move to in vivo animal model data for their drug, let's say, or they want to get, through their IND application acceptance, which means they can then go into the phase 1 clinical trial. Again, this is I apologize that this is very biotech centric, but this is my focus, so it's what I know best. But there'd be, similar milestones that other non-biotech companies would also want to meet, and therefore they need funds for as well. So how do we even find out what companies are fundraising and which ones might be interesting? So luckily, like we're friends with other VCs in the network that can let us know, like, oh, hey, like this company we invested in Series A, which is like what you call Series A, B, C, like different financing rounds. Seed round is the first round, Series A second, B third, et cetera. Pretty straightforward, I think. But so, hey, like a VC friend of ours will say, hey, we invested in like the seed round or Series A round for this company. We think it's super cool. They've done a lot of great work recently. The CEO is amazing. Will you take a look at them because they're fundraising now? We'd love to have you join as part of like the investor group. So that's one way you get sort of inbound, shared deals, let's say, and we call these things deals. So it's like, okay, there's a new deal for like a Series A fundraising for a company that's doing cell therapy for autoimmune disease, let's say. So that's one way. We also go to attend conferences. I think that's really fun. Part of the day is attending academic conferences like ASH and SITC and names that you all might recognize. I'm not sure, but I'll probably see you guys at some of the same conferences. And stay informed. And sometimes, sometimes it's just PIs that are presenting there, but they're starting to think about spinning out a company. So like, that's how early we're trying to also like have relationships with entrepreneurs is, I went to ASH, which is the American Society for Hematology conference last year, and saw a very interesting presentation from PI at Penn who had knocked out CD5 and CAR T cells, and it not only was then applicable, like made the cell therapy applicable to now T cell malignancies because CD5 is present on T cells, it also, as like a side effect, boost the CAR T cell activity. So I just thought that was a super cool talk. And so I like tried to reach out to him afterwards. Anyway, the point is that's like one way that you can also source a deal, because they could come back to you and say, actually, I was thinking about forming a startup, like let's chat. So that's kind of a cool way to get deals, but you can really get them from anywhere. Entrepreneurs will oftentimes proactively reach out to venture capitalists. Within the Boston biotech ecosystem, especially, like you just meet people. It's such a small world. Like you often have overlapping people, which is, as a side note, this is always why you should be nice to people, because you never know when they're like going to come back. In addition to just being a good person, obviously. But no, it's actually kind of amazing. Like even from Hopkins, like how many overlapping people in like that I've experienced or met in Boston that like we have a connection to Hopkins together or have some other weird connection. So anyway, so there's all sorts of ways. I don't want to belabor the point. There's all sorts of ways that you can find out which companies are fundraising. And so let's say, okay, that's great. And so what do they send you? Send you like a little blurb about the company. Oftentimes, this will be coming from the company into your email inbox. They'll also oftentimes send like a non-confidential deck, so a pitch deck. So oftentimes this will be like where, okay, if that looks good, they start to give you a high level of like what their technology is, what kind of like high level data they have behind it, like what market they're trying to address, what diseases are they going after, who's the team, like you'll have all the information you sort of need at a high level to think about whether or not it would be a good fit with your investment, whether you actually want to proceed to having a 1-hour meeting with them where they will walk you through pitch deck and pitch to you. So that is the kind of screening portion of like, so the next step. So it's like you hear about a deal, you screen it by kind of understanding high level what they're doing and whether or not it'd be a good fit. Then you move to the pitch meeting. So it's 1 hour, you chat with them, ask your questions as they present to you all of that information. And then from there you can move into, if you're still interested and you want to move into like a more deeper dive into the data, you go under CDA, so confidentiality agreement, so that you won't share their confidential data that's super early stage, super hidden, where there's lots of competition. You don't share it with anyone else. So you move into CDA, you get access into what they call their virtual data room, which is all of the data generated from that company to that point in time, all of the sort of patents, all of the corporate, like the contracts that they might have to even get that technology imported or get it made, like manufactured, that kind of thing. All of that information will be in the data room, and that's what you have to evaluate. So this is the evaluation stage I'm talking about now. So this is the fun part, in my opinion, where you're diligencing this company. So you're assessing like the technology, looking really closely at the technology and the data behind it. If you're not familiar with it, like for example, right now I'm looking at a company that is they're doing a novel viral gene delivery approach. We've also looked at non-viral approaches recently with the de-risking of lipid nanoparticles, thanks to COVID vaccine. That's also a very hot area. And let's say you're not super familiar with that area. I mean, my PhD was in like cancer cell biology. I don't know much about delivery. So that's not true. But like, I don't know as much as I should. And also with these novel technologies, like I say that in case Andrew's listening, I do know about CRISPR-Cas9 and like lentiviral delivery approaches. Anyway, point being, if you need to educate yourself, you can read scientific review articles, you can talk to key opinion leaders or sort of experts in the field to give you like the lowdown on that new technology, or like what are the limitations of current gene therapy approaches, for example. You can read about the gene therapies that are in the clinic and what have been their shortcomings. Like, so there's a whole like education process to not just understanding the potential investment, like the potential startups technology, but also understand like how it's positioned in this big field and why it might be better and why it might be differentiated. So that education process is super fun. You're constantly learning new things, because you're not only evaluating one company at a time. Oftentimes you have multiple that you're juggling at a time. So this process that I'm showing here is going on for, across tens of companies at a time, let's say, because you have lots of companies that are you're being introduced to, which is also really fun. Okay, so let's say you've analyzed the technology, you've analyzed the competition and how this company might be better than the competition, how they're differentiated. You've analyzed the market opportunities. So like what diseases, what genetic, in the case of gene therapy, what genetic diseases are going after, like what's the unmet need like there? Would this actually be, transformative for these patients? How much could they price this gene therapy for? You understand sort of more of the strategy and market opportunity, as it might be very familiar with, training for consulting. Market opportunity is a big part, as well as like looking at the competitive landscape. You've also analyzed, like you've done a whole question and answer session multiple times with like the scientific team at the company, for example. You're also thinking about, exit opportunities, as I mentioned. So if the company is going to go public or it's going to get acquired, like what are comparable companies in the gene therapy space and what are they valued at in the public market? What have others been acquired for? To get a sense of like, okay, if we know this company we're investing in is valued at X amount of dollars now, what will it be valued when it goes public, when we can actually exit our position in that company? And that gives us a sense of, back to your question, Oliver, like what a return on investment we may be able to expect. So we always, things can go wrong between like now and 2 years from now when we might exit, but the hope is that if it follows the right track and we've done our homework and the company continues to be on the right path, that we can expect X amount of return based on comparable companies in the space. Because essentially the market is what values that company when it goes public, right?
Sorry, can I ask you something?
Oh, absolutely.
Sorry. Okay. each VC has their own, let's say, strategy to evaluate the company, let's say, because you need to kind of forecast the cash flows. I mean, there's many ways that you can do it, and to say, okay, this company compared also with other ones that you were saying, like, this is the value that we think that it's now, the company, based on how much they can do in the future. But there is any, like a strategy or maybe model or certain, variables that each, in your team you take in account that maybe is different from other places or something like that. Like maybe there are, some secrets. I don't know. It's quite, difficult to evaluate the company anyway, but yeah, just to know a little bit more.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I should say it's different now that I'm doing it. It's a bit different than what I thought it might be. So a lot of times when you're investing in the later stage of the company, then what you're talking about forecasting is a bit more relevant. But if you think about it, like we're investing in companies, like if we're thinking about private side companies that are in preclinical models, right? Like they may or may not have an IND filed to be able to go into phase 1 clinical trials. They're not going to be making revenues off of the approved drugs that they have for, depends on what disease they're going after, but probably 8 years or more. So a lot of times the way, like those revenue forecasts that we would conduct today, which I did do a bunch of that when I was at ClearView, is forecasting. We were doing it for companies that were a bit later stage. And oftentimes it's very rangy, even when a company is in phase 1, right? Like there's a big range of what they could potentially make based on the competition, based on many, many factors like uptake, physician preference, that kind of thing. For us, we're going so early stage that the revenues that they can generate, like we have to understand high level market opportunity, right? Like if they're going after an ultra rare disease where there's like 2 patients that have diagnosed disease, like that's a bit scary. But if they're going after, if it's an oncology application or a gene therapy, like genetic disease type platform that can be applied to that, then we really do rely on the value of the comparable companies in the public market, as well as the acquisition, the deal activity that's been in that space as the way that we define value. And I think other venture capitalists who invest in early stage like we do also use those comparables. But if you're investing a bit later stage, I imagine hedge funds do this a lot, where, okay, you actually want to understand if they get an approved drug, like what kind of revenues can they bring in? Therefore, like what will the value be of this company? What kind of multiple can we expect? It's a bit different. So I can understand why forecasting might come in later when you're investing later stage. Does that answer your question, Gustavo?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, I just wanted to know, because also like it's different to evaluate a company that you already even know that it's public, because you can get access on, of course, as how they perform in the past. So then you can use certain, data to use it more to the future. If you even want to do an investment, like as a person, you want to invest in something. But, talking about startups that, as you said, like they are even not making any revenue, or you don't know, it's very uncertain, like, how you deal with that and how do you evaluate based on that, and probably it's also a lot of your own experience. I mean, sure, you're surrounded by people that already have a lot of experience in that. So it's a little bit also like, not a gut feeling, but yeah, something like that. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think it was a bit surprising. It's not like precise science or like math equation, but there are a lot of different factors that sort of, factor into whether we make an investment in addition to the exit opportunities. But when it comes to exit, it's exactly sort of how I laid it out. So yeah, it sounds like you understand. So that's great. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep an eye on the time because I definitely want to get to questions. All right, let's say we check out the company, it looks great. We want to proceed to making an investment. Then there's a negotiation on terms. Like you have to agree with the entrepreneur, like what they think their company's value is at that current moment versus what we think it is. You go back and forth discussing those numbers. You discuss like what other investors are in the syndicate. So it's a group of people who are trying to also, oftentimes these fundraising rounds are like $100 million. Multiple investors are contributing like a portion of that. I'm not going to get too bogged down on this, but there's a lot of negotiation. You go to a term sheet, everyone sort of signs, wire the money to the company. Great, you're now a part owner of that company. Then after that, as I mentioned, there's sort of the quarterly meetings that you have with the biotech team, with the startup team, where you help guide that team forward, help make tough decisions, help hear, also hear updates in the past quarter, what's happening, where are they like not meeting the expectations, like what what kind of barriers or issues are they encountering, and you sort of, again, help guide it forward. And then I think I've talked about exit enough here. So I think you guys get it. It's when we exit our position through a liquidation event. Okay. Any questions? I guess, again, like I don't want to kind of rush through this, but I also definitely want to have time for all of the questions that have been asked already and also will be asked. So any questions on like the basics of VC, and then next I can talk about how this applies to sort of the interview process as well. Okay, great. So the interview process, maybe I'll just layer in here, is you often have like a fit portion when you're in, this is an interview process for a venture capital fund. I can really only talk about biotech VC specifically, my experience, as well as a few of my friends in biotech VC, but their experience has been, you are given a case. It's it's a slightly different case than you might be given, definitely very different than a generalist VC fund, or sorry, consulting firm, slightly different probably than, life science specific consulting firm. They really want to understand like how you evaluate a potential deal. So the case is based on kind of what I walked you all through, right? Assessing, like, let's say the prompt for the case is like, oh, there's a company that's developing a new drug with this mechanism of action in ulcerative colitis or in like IBD within like the GI space. Like, how would you go about evaluating it? So sometimes it's like something like that where you'd have to think about, like, walk through your thought process of how you go about evaluating that company relative to competitors, whether you think it might be a sound investment or not based on like high level information. For me, like the process was a little bit more open-ended, where it was like, why don't you tell us about a cool technology or a cool company that you think we should invest in and why? And so I almost wrote like a mini memo about a space in RNA targeting therapeutic space, specifically ADAR technology. I don't have to get into it now, but basically it could kind of take two different forms where they like give you a fairly specific prompt that you have to sort of walk through your evaluation for that specific company, or they could be more open-ended and say, what do you think is a cool area of technology or a cool company that we should invest in? So it's pretty fun, honestly, because it does, I think, mimic the job pretty well. But then again, you're not, it's a little also risky because it's like you don't get feedback right away from, like in consulting, you get feedback as you're going, you have someone kind of coaching you through the case. With VC, it's like they kind of let you go off with that prompt for a couple days or a day and come back to them with like something written up. But it is really fun. And like there are plenty of like sources and Googling you can do to help you get to the answer. So hopefully that answers your question, Ria. That's about the interview process. And I know you had one other question, which I've done too much talking at this point to fully remember, so that's my fault. I think you wanted me to sort of talk through some of the names of different VC funds. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then, sorry, I'm reading through the chat too. You also had asked like how much numbers heavy prep should one do for the case? Not too much. Hopefully like walking through sort of the valuation, how you value different companies, like gives you an idea of the math. I had to do way more math when I was at ClearView Healthcare Partners doing the forecasting models. That was way more complicated than sort of what you do in VC. But again, if you're applying to like a hedge fund or something that's a bit later stage, the math might be a bit more intense. Okay. And then, maybe I'll go to my next slide then. And then from here can talk about the different VC names. So I just laid out like high level what the different types of VC firms are. It's very hard to sort of bucket them, I will say, because there are a lot of overlaps. And I also, Ria, I'm sorry, but this is more like biotech rather than like healthcare umbrella bucket. Healthcare is more like, can have like health tech, it can have other, I'm honestly less familiar with it because I'm more in like the therapeutics investments and like biotech investments. We do a little bit of diagnostics, but it's all within like life sciences. So I'm much more familiar with that. But I'm happy to maybe follow up with you if you want to have like a chat about companies you're thinking about. But the way I thought about segmenting the biotech VC firms though are as follows. So I already kind of name dropped flagship, but there are company creation models versus traditional investment models. So company creation examples would be like Flagship Pioneering, Third Rock Ventures, Atlas Ventures. These are huge, like, I don't know, I say huge because I mean they're hugely successful, like very successful. They know what they're doing. That's like kind of their bread and butter is creating these really innovative, cool companies surrounding interesting science or interesting PIs that have very strong science. They build a company around them. So Flagship obviously is known for it's for Moderna, but it has a lot of other great companies that they've created. Third Rock also is very much into company creation. Atlas is very good at company creation. I will say also, the reason why you can't bucket it perfectly is because Atlas also invests in already formed companies, but in the Series A, like in the very early stage rounds. So again, these are not MECE, I guess I should say, like they're not mutually exclusive, like there's a lot of overlaps. It's not a perfect division of buckets here, but that's an example. And then there's more traditional like institutional investors, like trying to think. Honestly, more and more are now going into company creation as well as traditional. So it's like harder to sort of name drop those. For us, we're also like for Solasta, we're also thinking we've been historically a traditional investor that's invested in already formed companies, but we're trying to also move into like helping with company creation. But there's plenty of other big VCs. Like, I'm trying to think if Echo R1 is another big one, a big shop. There's Longwood Fund, but they do company creation. There's so many of them do company creation these days. Like Vcs Ventures does like majority traditional investment, but they've done seeded a couple companies as well. So again, this is not a great breakdown anymore because more and more are moving to company creation, but it's one way to think about it. Another big bucket is like corporate or strategic VCs. So these are like big pharma companies within biotech that have, or within, again, specifically the sector, that have a big venture capital arm. So Pfizer Ventures is a very active corporate venture company firm. There's Sanofi, AbbVie, like you name a big pharma, they probably have a venture arm. And it also gives them early access to looking at really cool technology that they can later think about whether they want to either acquire or in-license into their own company. There's also Alexandria Venture Investments, which is actually a real estate firm that has a huge venture arm and has been very active in biotech investment because they actually lease out lab space, which is how they started sort of in the biotech world. And they've now I see them anytime like I see a press release for like a new company that's raised money, I feel like they're participating in it. So they're very, very active. Sorry, there's a question here. Yes, Oliver.
Just wondering, because you said the big pharma firms nowadays have VC firms attached. Don't want to say anything bad about VC firms, but does it happen that they get the majority owner and then sell to themselves for like a really cheap price?
Oh no, that's a great question. So the question was like, is there a conflict of interest basically with like with a corporate venture capital investing in a company and then later like directing that company to have to sell to Pfizer, for example, if it's a Pfizer venture capital? Great question. No, there are some rules to prevent that. Sometimes they will not be able to take a board seat, so they won't be able to actually direct or vote on important things for that company to avoid conflict of interest. A lot of times the terms of, so is that term sheet when a company like gets an investment. Oftentimes, even if Pfizer Ventures sort of leads or drafts up that term sheet, the other investors participating in the financing round will fight hard for Pfizer, for example. This is, I will say, nothing against, like, this is just because Pfizer is so active, but like, this is just an example. This doesn't necessarily happen, but they will prevent Pfizer from having the ability to write in the term sheet, like that Pfizer Ventures will have the right to like first negotiation or the first refusal. Like there'll be certain terms in there to make sure that Pfizer isn't only able to sell to Pfizer. If that makes sense, like that there will be like availability to have business development deals with other pharma companies. And a lot of times, like these pharma, like what's been happening more and more is these corporate VCs are very collaborative. So for example, we as Solasta, like in early 2019, we co-led a Series A financing round with Pfizer Ventures and Takeda Ventures. So like all three of us were like leading this financing round, and they play together very well. Like we, everyone gets along very well. So I think the hope is that yes, they make good investments that they can later, in license or maybe even acquire, but that's not their sole. That might be the directive, but that's not the sole intent. They also want that company to obviously be successful, and they realize that part of that success is not bearing down on that company and like making them do certain things that is going to turn out badly for everyone. So hopefully that answers your question, but I think that's a very sound question. But there's certain rules about they can't own more than a certain percentage. They can't have a board seat. Like there's certain measures in place to make sure it's not very messy, I guess you could say, or like manipulative. Okay, cool. So I'll try to breeze through these. So there's also sector specific. So I mentioned we at Solasta mostly invest in therapeutics ventures. We've done one diagnostics play, but there's going to be some companies some funds that only do invest in medical devices, for example, or digital health or diagnostics, those types of things. But also stage specific. So I've mentioned like seed, Series A, that's very early stage. Like oftentimes companies will have like Series B, Series C, or like crossover rounds before they go into the public market. So you could be like someone who only wants to invest in like the first round of the company, get in at the first round and have like majority, shares at least in the beginning. And then some VC funds that only like to invest in clinical stage companies. So those are becoming more few and far between because as we've talked about the dynamics already, that companies are going public so early, but there are still some that really like to see clinical data before they make a decision. So that's sort of like a few ways I could think about slicing up the, the industry, but like I said, there's so much overlap sort of between, at least with like sector specific, stage specific, company creation, like it's blurred for sure, but I at least wanted to highlight a few different ways you can think about it. So I try to also pepper in, I guess, a few, like, for example, Sofinova Ventures is a company or is a VC that likes to invest in clinical stage companies. So I tried to also name drop a little bit to hopefully get to Ray's question, but definitely, like I said, you and I can chat about health tech, or I can think about if I know anyone that I could direct you to for that sector specifically, because I'm not as familiar. Is that helpful? And are there any other questions you had that I didn't get to? Priya?
Yes, and just wanted to ask, how much time does it take usually for the interview process? Is it like consulting firms take a lot of time, like 1 or 2 months for all the rounds to happen, and then a presentation round, etc. So how fast is the hiring for VC, or how slow is it? And should one apply closer to graduation, or just start looking up firms anyway and like starting that conversation? So what do you recommend?
Great question. Unfortunately, not a very satisfying answer. It's very variable. So for Solasta, it was very quick for me. I think I found out within a couple of weeks, but I have a friend right now who's going through the interview process at Third Rock Ventures, and it's been taking several months, for him. So I think it's very variable. So I think I would just maybe try to be if you can reach out to somebody at the VC fund that you're interested in, for just a quick informational interview, you can ask about hopefully those questions. Most folks are willing to chat. I would hope, I would think, and they can give you that kind of information about their fund, about their specific firm, and as well as what that interview process looks like. Even though I think mostly it is case based. So for example, my friend going through Third Rock, he had a broad prompt just like I did, where it was like, what's a cool technology that you think that you want to plan, sort of what are the next stages for like the experiments you have to do to prove that technology based on like a paper in the literature you read, and like what are the challenges and like risks around that. Oh, I should mention a big part of our diligence is what are the risks involved with this investment, and how are they going to be mitigated? Sorry, that's a huge part of our analysis. But so thinking through that in the case interview as well is important. So hopefully not a very satisfying answer, but hopefully you can find someone helpful at the precise fund that you're interested in for timeline to start, as well as timeline of like the interview process.
Yeah,
but I think a lot of times, I think similar to consulting, like if funds are hiring PhDs, they understand it's going to take a little while to wrap up. So I would think they'd be willing to work with you on that. I will say, I know I keep talking about how like this past year has been so different or so crazy, but I think like there are more jobs than ever especially within like life sciences VC, because there's so much capital now being poured in from LPs getting all excited about the hot biotech market, right? So I think now more than ever, there are more jobs, but they also might be going through the interview process more quickly because they actually need investors on their team to help them deploy all this capital that they're now responsible for. That's at least my my impression of what's going on right now. So things right now might be a bit different than they were even like a year or two ago with the interview process and timelines. So again, I think just go straight to the source if you can to figure out the answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Just want to remind you the room is booked like
Oh, right after this. Okay. Okay, sorry. Yeah, this time has flown by and I feel like I did end up talking way more than I thought I would or hoped to be. So I know we have like a minute or two left. There was a question about doing part-time consulting. Sure, do it. Like, I think honestly, getting any sort of experience away from the bench while you're in your, I assume you're in your PhD now or in some sort of lab environment. I definitely highly recommend doing internships, doing pro bono consulting, taking advantage of the resources here because you do have, at least if you're at Hopkins, which I assume you are, like there's the PDCO, there's a consulting club, there's opportunities for internships that Hopkins has relationships with. There's, I'm sure, other opportunities out in the Baltimore area. Definitely take advantage of them if you can. I know it's easier said than done when you're trying to work really hard in lab, but I think you'll be surprised that you can, I'm sure you can find a way. And I think it does help you look like you're not just a pure scientist if you're thinking about moving away from the bench. It helps you like show that you can think about other like you're thinking through like what you want to do next and how to educate yourself on topics that are not just thesis related. Just my 2 cents, but so, okay, you're a 2019 PhD grad, currently working as a manager in healthcare corporate. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that's great. So hopefully, I'm not sure what you want to do next, but hopefully what you're doing now is very helpful for either further consulting opportunities or VC as well. I think I have here actually my email address if anyone wants to ping me either through email or through LinkedIn for any additional questions that are like specific to you. I'm happy to sort of talk about that offline. I know we're running up on time. I don't know if I have time for like one more.
5, 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, 5 or 10 more minutes. I know we're supposed to close kind of at the hour, but if anyone has any like general questions, or I hope I made things clear. That was my intent, that you at least came away like understanding a little bit more about VC. And I know I didn't touch on consulting too much, but I'm happy to answer like consulting questions. Maybe I'll give my 2 cents here, even though no one's asking for it right now, but I highly recommend consulting as a stepping stone to VC. I think you get, and a stepping stone to anything really, but you get such a great education. Like I was only in consulting for like a little over a year, and I just am way more efficient at my job in venture capital than I would have been straight out PhD. That being said, if you can get a VC job straight out of the PhD, that's great. I'm sure you'll learn on the job, but in terms of a training environment and learning a lot of both content as well as like soft skills through consulting, I just feel like a year in consulting is like saves you like 3 years of like trying to like learn on your own. But again, there's no wrong route if you do want VC, but I will say like highly recommend consulting. No regrets making that move to consulting. I loved ClearView. I learned a ton. I still use a lot of that information and skills that I learned in consulting for my current job. And I know all my friends who also went to consulting, feel the same way, even if, certain weeks in consulting are pretty tough and you're like, why did I do this? I'm like working till midnight because the client's not happy or whatever it might be. Definitely worthwhile. And the people you meet in consulting are awesome too. Yeah, everyone's super smart and fun and great.
Like in consulting firms, they have those immersion programs for PhD students only. Like VC company offer those types of programs as well?
That's a great question. So just to make sure everyone heard, it's like, so there are immersion programs for consulting, right? Like Bridge to BCG and I don't know, Connect to ClearView, right? These like 3 or 4 day programs or weekend programs to get to know what a day in the life of a consultant is like, or what a project would be like. The question is, are there programs like that for VC? And the answer is yes, there oftentimes are, or like there are now internship opportunities as well. So I know, I don't know about in this area. I don't know if like Catalio or certain VC groups here have the opportunity. I believe that they do actually. I think I know a friend who joined Catalio as an intern. So I would say take advantage of that if you can, if they need you to be local. Nowadays, like remote, you could, potentially do that same thing, a fellowship or an internship at a different fund. So Vcs Ventures, for example, VIDA Ventures also runs like a fellowship program. So they often will take PhD students or postdocs and let them join part-time and get some deal experience, get some investing experience. So highly recommend that opportunity. I feel like that's becoming more and more prominent, and definitely take advantage of it. Great question.
How much of your work can you do remote?
Okay, so Oliver asked how much of my work can I do remotely? Well, I joined Solasta in September of 2020, and I basically didn't go into the office until like we are vaccinated. So I was able to do it all remotely. And there's so many people, honestly, I know I keep referring to this, but so many people joined Venture during COVID because they're hiring like crazy that I made a lot of friends remotely. I know it sounds weird, but I made friends through Zoom. Like like people are very open when they're new to the field. Like they want to meet other venture capitalists. As I mentioned, like you grow your network, you have friends that you bounce ideas off of, or you pick their brains, or they send you deals, and they really become like friends. And it's so fun. But I think there's so many people who joined and were in the same boat as I was, that we would schedule these like one-on-one coffee chats that would be through Zoom, and we just like chit chat, get to know each other. So I think like that networking piece would probably be the toughest part to do remotely for the job, and not actually because everyone was just, giving into Zoom and giving into like virtual meetups, because we all like missed that social part, that, it actually made it quite easy to get to know people that way. And then in terms of the other parts of the job of like meeting startups, that was all done through Zoom too. So the pitch meetings would be through Zoom. So I heard so many times, and it's true for Solasta too, that we invested in a company, we haven't even met the team in person yet, or we haven't been to the labs. That is actually kind of crazy, if you can imagine, because there's certain funds that are giving like $20 million to a company and they haven't met in person. But you have ways of sort of vetting the team and vetting the legitimacy without actually having to be there in person. Of course, it's great now that we're vaccinated and people are getting more comfortable with in person to like actually meet. but sometimes biotech had to keep on moving during that time, and so we've kind of figured out how to do it all virtually. So, but otherwise, all of the analysis, all the evaluation of the company on the back end, this is all sort of, I think, always been remote to an extent, because these virtual data rooms have always sort of been in place to go through all of the paperwork and data associated with the company. So it's really those like networking pieces and meeting companies pieces that went remote and did so pretty effectively.
Do you work in an office, or do you work remotely from home?
Okay, so yes, we have an office. So Solasta has an office in Boston, and I go in, occasionally. But when I work remotely, I either work here because my boyfriend is here, or here in Baltimore, or I do live in Boston, about a mile away from the office. So I'll work from my apartment. But yeah, it's very flexible. But I think more and more now, people are trying to slowly go back in office, at least for a day or two. And that seems to be common amongst like other VCs now as well, like slowly getting back to in-person setting. Of course, now, sometimes we go in person and we still take Zoom calls from the office, right, with startups, but we'll see if it ever returns to like fully 100% where like you meet the startup team physically for the first meeting. Well, I don't think it will go back to that fully, but we'll see. Great. So I know we're over time, but like I said, I think you all see my email address here. Feel free to ping me or LinkedIn me if you have any questions. I hope that you all found it helpful. Oops, sorry, I just clicked back. Yeah, I'd definitely love to hear any other thoughts or any like clarification that anyone needs. Definitely let me know. And I appreciate you all being here, and thanks for zooming in. Thanks for being here in person. Really appreciate it. It's nice to be back at Hopkins. Definitely miss it. Everyone enjoy the rest of your time here. Even you will miss it, I think, believe it or not. Yeah, so
Yeah.
thanks.
I think the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So like us on the YouTube channel.
Awesome, yes.
Okay.
Check it out
Thank
on
you
the YouTube channel.
everyone for showing.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, bye all.